Okay, so CES 2012 has officially wrapped up, and for those who might not know, CES is the Council of Engineering and Scientific Society Executives annual meeting that just happened in Louisville, Kentucky. And I'm here today with Avinash Chandarana, MCI Group's Learning and Development Director, who is joining me from Belgium, where he's just returned. Thank you so much for joining us, Avinash.
Great to be with you.
And so last year you were the keynote speaker at CES 2011. How was the conference this year?
It was great. It was actually great to be back with the same organization a year on and meet some familiar faces and also have people actually approach me saying that they remembered, and this was nice, they remembered the keynote from last year, and to my surprise, which actually I was really proud of, was that they actually gave me some examples that they were using from the keynote even 1 year on. So that was great. That was the most important thing, that it was applicable to people.
Wow,
so it was nice to see some faces.
Yeah, definitely.
And to know that they were applying what I was talking about.
Yeah, I've heard some wonderful things. So, so you presented a couple different sessions. One was the Management Institute, which was a day-long workshop, and also you spoke on understanding the cultural considerations when offering education globally. And from your research, you mentioned that over half of CEOs are planning to send more staff on international assignments. And the number of international assignments among multinationals increased 25% over the past decade and are predicted to grow further 50% over the next 10 years. What types of cultural insights, competencies, and capabilities need to be in place to successfully manage cross-cultural business interactions?
Well, Kylie, I think there's a number of different competencies when it comes to the cross-cultural scope of things. It's not just one particular competency that you need. You need to have a whole range. And I think the first place to start is always with yourself and understand really what your culture is all about, where you're coming from, what drives your behaviors and what drives your attitudes and the way you see the world. And I think that's a very, very important place to start, because then you have a frame of reference. So prior to actually making any organization, whether it's an association or a corporate company, posting staff on an international assignment is to definitely ensure that their staff go through the relevant education. And that means a number of different things. It can actually include online assessments, which actually determines your cultural profile. Of course, there's a lot of different books out there on the market and a lot of great authors that I would encourage anyone to look into. But that's just the first step. So understanding your own self, your own culture, and your behaviors, and why that's the case. Often the why is missed out. Why is it that we behave the way we do? What drives our thought patterns? How do we make decisions? How do we communicate? Right. And once you have that frame of reference, the next step is really to understand, for example, the target culture that you're going to be living in or working with, is understanding, of course, what are those cultural insights that you need to learn about that particular target culture. And going much deeper than the level of surface and the awareness level. Most of us are very good at understanding the basic business etiquette, for example, when you're going to China or to Latin America. But once again, that key question comes back as to why is it, for example, that in Latin America, for example, Brazilian culture or Argentinian culture, why is it that they make decisions the way they do? How do they interact with one another? What is their approach when it comes to negotiations or making contracts? So I think that's a much deeper level. It's going, as we say, in the cultural perspective, is going below the surface of an iceberg. So the iceberg is 1/3 above the waterline, but the deepest aspect is below. And that's the same with culture. We see above the iceberg, and we see, for example, what is observable in general about how we dress, how we talk, how we eat, what we drink, etc. Those are all observable characteristics. But what's more important is to go below the surface and understand the values of a culture. So those are just some of the thoughts that I would sort of put out there in terms of anyone that's interested to go to another culture and to adapt themselves.
Okay, wonderful. And just before I forget, a few of the books you mentioned, what types of titles or authors should we be looking for?
Well, authors, the most famous one, I would say the guru when it comes to culture is the anthropologist Edward T. Hall. And any work by Edward T. Hall is tremendous. And he really did a lot of the foundational work. But of course, then we have Geert Hofstede, Fons Trompenaars, and someone that I know very well is Richard Lewis. Richard Lewis has written a great book called When Cultures Collide. So I would say definitely if there's one book I would recommend, it's that one.
Wonderful.
So there's a lot out there.
Okay, great. Thank you for those. And so what types of cross-cultural training need to happen to prepare staff to grow globally?
Well, I guess it comes back to my first point, is when it comes to cross-cultural training, is that there are assessments that are out there. With Richard Lewis, there is one with what they call Culture Active, and that allows you to do, as I said, a personal assessment. So it puts you in a framework of exactly, which type of culture are you within? I mean, typically, of course, if you are coming, let's say, from an American culture, this assessment would basically identify, okay, what traits do you have which relate to what we would consider as, let's say, American culture? Now, not everything in your own assessment may relate to that. You may find yourself surprisingly being able to adapt yourself quite well, for example, to a Latin American culture, because some of your personal traits may be a little bit different than what is considered to be a standard American culture. Of course, we know there's no one standard, but generalization is quite typical when we talk about cultures. For example, the introverted culture are, for example, the Asian cultures. The more extroverted cultures or more direct cultures tend to be, for example, Anglo-Saxon cultures, or even including Germany and most Western or Northern European cultures. So doing an assessment, I think, is a very good starting point. Of course, beyond that, of course, you have your readings, you can attend cross-cultural workshops. So I think education and learning and development is fundamental. Another great way, I think, is to have a short-term posting or an assignment before you take a deep dive straight and say, okay, I'm going to jump in, I'm going to move to that country. Why not actually spend at least maybe a few weeks or a month getting to know that culture? I know that's not always possible, but if you're serious about adapting yourself to a culture, then immersion is one of the best ways to do so.
Right. This is great advice. And when an association considers offering education globally, whether it's a webinar or a conference or a short assignment, like you said, what are the unique differences in how various cultures prefer to learn, interact, and study?
There are significant differences, in fact. And if we now, as I said, generalization does tend to happen, and there's a reason to be general here. They come from somewhere. The stereotypes or generalizations don't exist without a reason. So some of the things we can be clear. Let's for example take what we call individualism and collectivism. Now, this is something coming also from one of those authors I referred to, which is Hofstadter's philosophies. He said that several societies are individualistic, and I will take America as an example. America is known to be a society that's very individualistic in the sense that, and this is not, by the way, to be clear, it's not right or wrong, it's just the way it is.
Right.
Individualism means certainly that, when you grow up in the United States, and I know this through personal experience, having lived there and worked in the United States, you're taught at a very young age, for example, to stand up for yourself, speak up, and to be, let's say, a winner. And competition is, of course, something that's very, I think, fundamental to a lot of people that grow up in the United States. Now, if we, on the contrary, take a collective culture, for example, an Asian culture like Japan, like China, and several others, Korea, Taiwan, these cultures, you are taught and raised to basically be a part of a group, because social harmony is important. So completely on the opposite side, we're not talking about standing out from the crowd and really saying what's on your mind, especially not challenging, for example, a teacher or a facilitator or a trainer. So if we take those cultural traits from individualism and collectivism and put that into the learning and development or educational scope of things for an association, it's very common that if you're giving, for example, a face-to-face workshop, if you're doing that in a lot of, let's say, these individualistic cultures or societies, it's very common to be interactive and to break things out into, sessions where people are encouraged to collaborate with one another, and to also, I think, sometimes question the trainer and to question the trainer's knowledge. But that's considered healthy, and it's a great form of learning, by the way. And that's one type of adult learning in itself. But in collective cultures, that whole concept of not challenging the teacher, because the teacher is the guru.
Right.
Even if the teacher doesn't know, in many cases the teacher sometimes will, let's say they will say a white lie if they don't know an answer, but they will never say, I don't know the answer. And the individuals are encouraged to work in groups, certainly, but if you were to ask a question, even if this is an online workshop, like a live learning, a synchronous learning, if you just openly say, okay, well, is there anyone out there who would like to respond to a question? The chances are unlikely that someone coming from a collectivist culture where they also work with high context communication, where a lot of it's around relationships and harmony.
Right.
Those people will not speak out. And so that will also apply in the face-to-face workshop environment as much as on the online environment. So techniques are important to engage those people in different ways, making sure that they work in smaller groups, that they're not being, it's not confrontational, for example, and encouraging them sometimes to obviously, yes, get involved in, for example, polls, and sometimes using the chat box is not a bad thing. And those things tend to work a little bit better. But open communication is not something that, working with collective cultures, there's sometimes those Asian cultures that will always work as well as it does in individualistic cultures.
Very interesting, especially when we get to, like you said, online communities, social media, that sort of thing. So fascinating. Thank you so much, Avinash. I know that you're running to Shanghai now, so I really appreciate the time you took with us today and look forward to learning more.
You're more than welcome. Great to be with you.